Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I talk about the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are talking about the first Roger Moore film, Live and Let Die, his introduction to the James Bond film series. It was a major landmark for the series. In fact, you could argue that Live and Let Die and Roger Moore's appearance in the series is what allowed the character to live on. There was certainly a big question mark hanging over the future of the series after Sean Connery departed once and for all after Diamonds Are Forever, though he would again make a return to the role in the 1980s with Never Say Never Again. And we are forced to reckon with the fact that Roger Moore's Bond, as much as the character diverges from Connery's portrayal, as much as the version of the character that is portrayed by Roger Moore diverges from Fleming, this is the version of the character that has allowed Bond to endure as a cinematic icon. In fact, it's over the course of Roger Moore's tenure that certain ideas we now take for granted, that Bond is this icon of Britishness, that in some ways he is a symbolic vessel of the British Empire itself, is something that's really introduced with Roger Moore. Now, it's not introduced here in Live and Let Die per se, but it comes in under the course of his tenure when we hit The Spy Who Loved Me and he's leaping off cliffs with Union Jack parachutes. Roger Moore is really an extraordinary entertainer, and I love Roger Moore, and I love his interpretation of Bond very dearly. No Bond certainly works as hard to entertain the audience as Roger Moore's Bond does. From the very first moment he's on screen, Roger Moore is working overtime to entertain with every bit of screen time that he has. Even in a scene that like the one he has in Live and Let Die, where he's just in a hotel room looking for bugs, you see how much work and how much intelligent theatricality he is bringing to otherwise mundane actions. No other Bond certainly has as much panache for dialogue either. Roger Moore's Bond tends to be more verbal than the others. He uses words like a weapon, and he often says things to amuse himself at other people's expense. And no other Bond does as well with it as Roger Moore. In fact, Roger Moore, even when he's given some of the corniest lines or the most distasteful lines, Roger Moore says them with such effortlessness and such glee that it somehow works. And you notice some of the other Bonds really struggle with that sort of off-the-cuff line delivery, and it just all comes easily for Roger Moore's Bond. There's a certain ease about Moore's Bond and Moore's interpretation of Bond that is infectious and watchable. And it's a sort of carefree ease that had been introduced when he played the character of the Saint. The Saint was obviously what had introduced Roger Moore to audiences. It's what had queued him up for the role of James Bond in many ways. Just like Pierce Brosnan was endeared to audiences through his performance as Remington Steele before eventually taking on the role, Roger Moore was known to audiences through his performance as the Saint. It's worth noting that Roger Moore's performance as James Bond is different from his performance as the Saint. The Saint, while being a mischievous playboy character who gets into adventures while globetrotting, is a much kinder version of a character than we see of Roger Moore's James Bond when he's introduced. Indeed, Live and Let Die goes at great pains to not just distinguish his version of James Bond from Roger Moore's version of the Saint, but also from Sean Connery's James Bond, which loomed large over the character, to the extent that George Lazenby had trouble taking over the role once Sean Connery departed initially after the film You Only Live Twice. So here, Roger Moore was really given a challenging task to make the series his own, and he's aided in the fact that the series really shifts gears here. Diamonds Are Forever, as a movie, had left the series admittedly in a weird place. Diamonds Are Forever is a fairly strange Bond movie. It was a strange Bond movie in the sense that it was an attempt to return to the glory days of Goldfinger for Sean Connery, but it also just introduced a sort of uh, 1970s cynicism to the humor and a sort of camp that left the character himself in a weird place. And so Roger Moore was able to come in and ground it in a slightly new portrayal in a film that took Bond out of his typical context. Looking to the novels of Ian Fleming, they picked Live and Let Die, which situates Bond in a territory where he is a distinct outsider. As one of the characters describes Bond when he wanders into Harlem in the film Live and Let Die, he's like it's like following a cue ball. Bond sticks out in the world of Live and Let Die. And that is because Bond has effectively wandered not just into a new territory, but into a new film genre. Live and Let Die is built around the Blaxploitation genre, the genre of exploitation films that was built around the Black experience in America, and was a fertile ground for many Black actors of that time. And we get some tremendous performances from Yaphet Kotto, Jeffrey Holder here, and some of the more memorable characters of the series. And at one point, it was even going to be Diana Ross who was in talks to play Solitaire, and that would have been a tremendously bold move. Now, being in this genre, it's interesting that Live and Let Die is mostly using it for, I would say, aesthetic purposes rather than exploring some of the true racial and political tensions the way that the Blaxploitation genre often did. That was often front-loaded in Blaxploitation movies in ways that could be fairly compelling when you see some of the greats of the genre, like Across 110th Street. But here it shines a light on Bond's Britishness. And so let's talk about how Bond is introduced in Live and Let Die, because he's not in the pre-title sequence. In fact, it kind of suspends his introduction as though it's leaving room for him to enter and take center stage. And it sets up the context of the villain's activities here. The villains are operating in different theaters of the world: the United Nations, the streets of New Orleans, and in the deep tropical territory of the fictional island of Saint Monique, kind of a stand-in for Haiti, where voodoo ceremonies are occurring. And this sets up this idea that the villains exist in these different spheres of the world as well. Kananga, the primary villain of the film, is a character who inhabits these different worlds and shifts identities according to where he's at in it. And similarly, his primary henchman, Baron Samedi, does the same thing. And so you see this sort of identity shifting becomes a key part of the narrative. In fact, it's foregrounded in the fact that the villain has a dual identity. He wears makeup to masquerade as a Harlem gangster. He also adopts the persona of a diplomat. And then he is a somewhat sophisticated drug lord in the Caribbean. And this sort of shifting of identities is a really interesting element for these characters, because it kind of adds an uneasiness to the way that they inhabit the world. And coupled with this sort of voodoo coloring, it adds a layer of uncanniness. Live and Let Die is the only film in the Bond canon that flirts with the supernatural. Certainly, at its center is Solitaire, a fortune teller, the primary Bond girl of this installment. And she does seem to be able to tell the future. So, despite the film playing a little bit coy about just how extensive her abilities are, it doesn't really ever revoke the idea that she is somewhat prescient. So, that being the case, we have this sort of uncanny feeling for Live and Let Die that is very unique. And despite all the aspects of this movie that are deeply problematic, and the aspects of the film that are also just kind of like, there's a shagginess to this movie, I would say. There's a unique ambiance to it, even outside of the Bond film franchise, that makes it a fairly unusual movie. And I think the peculiar stew is evident right from the outset, where we have this big voodoo sacrifice sequence where a British man is murdered in a voodoo ceremony, and it transitions straight into a Paul McCartney anthem over surreal, nightmarish imagery of flaming skulls and things like that. It's in the typical Bond title sequence way. That sort of heightened nightmarish surrealism, and the nightmarish surrealism is established in the Ian Fleming Bond novels. I should add that sort of, especially in novels like You Only Live Twice, with things like The Garden of Death. This sort of surreal, nightmarish texture, the sort of spookiness and sort of strangeness of it is heightened in Live and Let Die. And it opens the door to Bond's introduction here. Right after the title sequence, we are presented with Bond in bed with a woman, as you would expect for James Bond. But he is interrupted because from his sleep by M, who has come to brief Bond on the 3 recent murders that he is now called upon to investigate. And immediately we get the sense that Roger Moore's Bond is a different character than the Sean Connery Bond. He's certainly a much more fussy, elegant character in some ways than Connery's Bond. It's certainly hard to imagine Connery's Bond fussing with the coffee machine the way that Roger Moore's Bond does here. And indeed, Roger Moore's Bond has a particularly antagonistic relationship with Bernard Lee's M. There's this sort of hostility between the two of them that I really enjoy, in the sense that Roger Moore's Bond has a very impish side. And in this movie in particular, it's laced with an air of condescension. There's a sense of almost cruelty about the way Roger Moore engages with people around him, in the sense that there doesn't seem to be much actual emotional concern for them. He is very much living at the world's expense, in this sense that he is just going through it, and kind of everyone around him is slightly utilitarian to him. And his talent for wordplay really just sort of is always putting people in their place in his hierarchy of the world. This softens quite a bit with Roger Moore's Bond, but I think it's generally underappreciated just how kind of like dark and mean Roger Moore's Bond is in his first 2 adventures, especially Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. There are dark touches in the subsequent movies, but he softens up a lot. You see a pretty ruthless side to Roger Moore's Bond, particularly in the way that he is approaching romance in this movie. There's certainly no real tenderness there. Both his romantic encounters in this movie, Rosie Carver and Solitaire, have a strongly manipulative side to them. With Rosie Carver, who he just doesn't trust, he's continually sort of lightly torturing her over the course of their dalliance together before her untimely death. The way he, sends her into the hotel bathroom where he's killed a snake, only for her to be, terrified at the sight of a dead, burnt snake on the floor, or, the fairly callous way in which he openly admits that he induced her to have a moment of romance together before threatening to kill her. that sort of cruelty is something that he inherits a little bit from Connery's Bond. Connery's Bond could be fairly cold-hearted and fairly dismissive in his relationships with women, but there's a, coupled with Roger Moore's general gait, there's a sort of general above-it-allness for Roger Moore's Bond. And obviously you see moments where he's nervous. One of the great moments in this movie is when he's surrounded by crocodiles and alligators at the farm, and you start to see Roger Moore's Bond sweat a little bit. He's trying to get out of there, but there's a sense in which there's a smug self-satisfaction about Roger Moore's Bond in this movie that is coupled with a pretty nasty edge. In general, the films of the early 70s, and we're talking about Diamonds Are Forever here, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun, have a sort of blackly cynical edge that gives their humor a little bit of bite. Bond is certainly always, making jokes at other people's expense, which he ordinarily does as well, but there's a sort of mean-spirited nature to these three movies in the early 70s that feels, in keeping with the spirit of the times, that I somewhat perversely enjoy, in a way that Roger Moore's Bond in Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun is kind of a jerk. He's fully an anti-hero. By the time we get to The Spy Who Loved Me, he's pivoted more into being a semi-heroic icon, but in Live and Let Die and Man with the Golden Gun, he's just kind of like a trickster jerk. And I kind of like how unapologetic these movies are about that, despite some of the aspects in which that can veer into like slightly distasteful territory, because I just enjoy how well Roger Moore plays that sort of cruel arrogance. Because if you've seen The Saint, you've seen him play like a softer, more tender version of this character. To see the character kind of be so cold to those around him, so ruthless, it really brings out a different facet of the Bond character, in the sense that Bond as a character in the movies, he's veered towards more heroic on occasion. But as the character really began, and going back to Fleming, he's firmly an anti-hero. And Roger Moore is not given enough credit for how he kind of embodies the sort of blunt instrument facet of the character in these first two movies, in the sense that he is really just kind of like a human weapon used by the British government to go out and clean up messes. And he's fairly dark in these first two movies. I do think his relationship with Solitaire is fairly interesting when juxtaposed with how Roger Moore's Bond softens later in his tenure. Certainly, there's a big age gap between Roger Moore and Solitaire in this movie. And and we see how differently the series will handle an age gap later in like For Your Eyes Only, where Bond and Beebe have a slightly more paternal relationship, whereas in this one it's a fairly manipulative relationship between Bond and Solitaire. And Bond is fairly open about that with Solitaire. But he definitely manipulates her into bed with him, and then subsequently, uses her to provoke Kananga a little bit. Not as bait per se, but in the context of different scenes in the movie, he plays that to his advantage as it goes along, and she's thus really brought into the crosshairs because of Bond's actions. And the kind of cruel irony of that is that Bond doesn't really get much information out of her in the course of that exchange. She's really just kind of an innocent in the course of this affair, who's been, kept in a very predatory relationship by Kananga. In typical Bond tradition, she is she is kind of the kept woman archetype that so often appears and reoccurs throughout Fleming's novels, certainly, um, where Bond is kind of uh, freeing them from their dark life. And in this sense, Bond, it's hard to say that Bond behaves honorably here. He's a fairly dishonorable character over the course of this movie. And it's interesting to see him play against the villains in this movie, because the villains outsmart Bond at quite a few different points in this movie. As confident as Bond is in himself and his own ability to succeed, there is a sense in which Bond is really flying by the seat of his pants in this movie, because there's so often a moment in this movie where Bond is just in over his head. And you just see that even in simple encounters where Bond is just kind of wandering into Harlem or wandering in New Orleans, and suddenly, like, those locations put Bond at a disadvantage because it's not his turf, and then suddenly he's confronting Mr. Big / Kananga, the dual identities of the villain. And I rather like the moment in this movie where Bond and Solitaire have been captured by initially Mr. Big, and then he reveals himself as Kananga. And it's a tense, emotional scene. Yaphet Kotto is great in it. It's just a great acting moment for him. But Bond is essentially put at a moment where he might lose his finger, and it all depends on Solitaire's ability to bluff. And she actually fails the bluff. We find out that it's really just Kananga who just didn't have the heart to kind of like go through with it in that moment, because he's so disappointed by the fact that she can't tell the future anymore, that she has betrayed him by dallying with James Bond. And that moment is also what leads directly into Bond being at the crocodile alligator farm and essentially being left to his own devices to survive. Bond, at any given point in this movie, Bond could have been taken out of the picture. There's a sense in which he's really just flying by on the basis of the luck. And that kind of goes with this sort of like trickster energy of Roger Moore's Bond. He's a character that has some basic skill and has some intelligence, but is also really just extraordinarily lucky. And you see that in a lot of the Roger Moore Bond movies, in some more extent than another. But in this movie, you certainly get a sense of that feeling, that he is just really... He's kind of out of his depth a little bit against Kananga and his operation. Roger Moore just has enough luck to get on the other side of these manipulative villains. In the end, Roger Moore succeeds. He kind of triumphs over the dark side of the supernatural here in the climax, which again, as with the rest of the movie, plays pretty coy with whether the supernatural elements are real or fictional, to what extent Baron Samedi is a truly supernatural character is left as a bit of a punctuated joke for the end of the movie, with him cackling on the front of the train memorably. The character would later reappear in the GoldenEye 007 video game as a character who, no matter how many times you killed him, he would just kind of keep reappearing in that level, and you'd have to kill him again. And it's a nice in-joke to this sort of trope in the movie. I think it would be really interesting to see the series attempt to flirt with the supernatural again, though it requires a fairly deft hand to do it. And in some ways, Live and Let Die is able to do it without raising serious questions, because the movie has such a lightness of touch and general aloofness about it. It's a fairly lackadaisical movie in a lot of ways. The movie, frankly, it's a vibe movie to a great extent. Rewatching it in preparation for this video, I was just struck by how much time it sets up just Bond arriving in San Monique and being in his hotel room, and how much time it spends in that hotel room. He arrives, he's checking for bugs, he's waiting for Rosie Carver to show herself, he's shaving, he almost gets attacked by a snake. Rosie Carver arrives, and even the next morning we're seeing the aftermath of that, where he's having breakfast and receives you know, the tarot card as a warning. There's a just sort of relaxed nature to the pacing that allows the atmosphere to really sink in. And in that way, the character functions less as a narrative driver and more as just kind of like this vehicle by which we are experiencing all these sort of like strange events and sights and sometimes exciting action moments. For a long time, the boat stunt in Live and Let Die held the record. So, you know, it was by no means shirking its responsibility as a Bond film to deliver cinematic spectacle, but there's this sense in which the audience is pulled along with this version of Roger Moore's Bond, in the sense that we're just kind of, Roger Moore's Bond just sort of drifts through the world and the audience with him. And it's a vibe that is fairly unique to Live and Let Die. Even The Man with the Golden Gun will become a little bit more, as sort of shaggy as that movie can be, it's a little bit more propulsive. Roger Moore's Bond is a little bit more of an aggressive detective in the follow-on than he is in Live and Let Die, where he's just kind of provoking certain reactions, but he's also just sort of coasting along as he can go throughout the course of this story too. So in retrospect, you know, looking back on this movie, it establishes Roger Moore's Bond as fairly ruthless, as condescending, as very verbal, as very stylish. He's you know, very attentive to clothing in a way that Connery's Bond generally wasn't. Connery's Bond looked aggressively stylish, but wasn't as ornamental in his attire as Roger Moore's Bond is. Roger Moore's certainly a showier dresser on the whole, and is also, you know, feels, just in context here, just by virtue of this being such a strong, like, fish out of water story, begins to inhabit this idea that Bond is a British figure in a decidedly not British world. And that is an identity that Roger Moore's Bond will really hone over the course of his tenure here. And different movies will lean into that different ways. Here, it feels very like a very politically charged dynamic. In subsequent movies, it's really just more of how Roger Moore embodies and carries this sense of Britishness with him in his manner wherever he goes. So let me know how you feel about Live and Let Die. It is a beloved film for many in the franchise. It was extremely popular upon release. It still remains a singular entry in the Bond canon, in the sense that I don't really feel like there's another Bond movie that does it. Certainly could look back to Dr. No's Adventure in Jamaica for something of the sort of pulp feeling that Live and Let Die starts to evoke, but Live and Let Die is clearly the product of a very unique moment in cinema and cultural history that, you know, as much as it's hard to reconcile certain aspects of it to our current moment, it still stands out as such a unusual experience that it looms large in my memory of the series, even though there are films I find myself admiring more in terms of their accomplishments. So let me know what you think of Live and Let Die. Let me know what you think of Roger Moore's Bond in this film. He's certainly a very calloused version of the character in this movie, and I'll look forward to engaging with you in the comments, and I'm very much looking forward to the next video too, where we discuss The Man with the Golden Gun, which is probably my favorite Roger Moore performance as James Bond. So I will catch you in the next one.